If you could tell me something about your understanding of attachment theory and why you use it in your work, and then we can move on to how you use it.
Okay.
I think it will develop from there.
Yes. Well, I suppose my journey into coming to know and use attachment theory started when I first trained as a social worker, when I retired from the army. And attachment theory is part of the training, but it's also quite traditional with Klein and Freud. And I think Klein and Freud can be quite seductive for someone who's coming to psychoanalysis new. But what I found when I actually started work as a probation officer was that attachment theory, I kept coming back to it because it really did seem to explain something that a more classical approach didn't quite get to. Not only that, it was very accessible to my clients. So it's a very accessible theory and can be used in those sorts of ways. But perhaps we should note that attachment theory isn't a standalone theory or therapeutic approach. I don't think Bowlby ever saw it in that way. I think it needs to be seen as a psychoanalytic perspective. And I think that's increasingly the case. And there is more of a convergence and a collaboration between what we might see as a more sort of classical approach, whether it's Kleinian or Freudian, and a more relational approach that's informed by attachment theory. One of the things about attachment theory too is that Bowlby saw it as a way of putting psychoanalysis onto a firmer empirical basis. And I think you can see the concept of internal working models that he borrowed from a chap called Craig at Cambridge. That can be equated with, say, object relations theory, or internalized object relations. And that in essence what we're talking about when we talk about either an object relations or relational aspect of psychoanalysis or attachment theory is some way of conceptualizing intrapsychic structure. It's just that attachment theory with the empirical base, particularly informed by the strange situation procedure and the adult attachment interview, puts it onto an empirical basis and in a way clarifies what the intrapsychic structure consists of.
So that really in any therapeutic endeavour, as in any human relationships then, that the attachment style, the attachment basis of the individual has got quite an influence on how that relationship may go.
I think so. Well, a very powerful influence, I would say. Obviously, if the person's been fortunate enough to have a secure upbringing with attuned, loving parents who have provided safety and security.
We probably won't see them, yes.
No, indeed not. I don't know whether you want to go into the two main organised insecure patterns of attachment.
I think that would be really helpful, particularly for clinical.
Well, in infancy, it's termed avoidant, and the strange situation shows that on reunion after a separation from the mother in the presence of a stranger in an experiential room with toys, that the avoidant child is very distressed. The skin galvanation has gone up, cortisol levels have gone up, heart rate has gone up. So this is a distressed child, but has learned by the age of 12 months that it's got to cope in a precociously independent way, so won't go to mum. Has learnt that mum can't cope with his or her states.
Stress,
so I think in essence the mother is getting, or the parent, the caregiver, is getting vicariously distressed by the child's distress. The child reads that and in, you might say, a Winnicottian false self way, adapts and conforms, complies to the messages that are being given out. So then, in adulthood, that's termed dismissing, which is what the adult attachment interview would reveal.
That's the parallel.
That's right. The corollary with the avoidant child becomes a dismissing adult. And those patterns, if nothing's been done to rectify them and help the child attain what's called earned security, these patterns tend to perpetuate and be carried forward. So then the dismissing adult, that would affect how they parent and how they run a romantic relationship. So again, there is this emotional detachment, a fear of intimacy or discomfort with intimacy, and a difficulty of asking for help, so becoming precociously self-reliant and overly so.
Yes.
With the ambivalent resistant child, the child will acknowledge the reunion with the mum, but then you get approach and avoidant behaviour at the same time. That's why it's called ambivalent resistant. We'll cling to mum but pull away, and therefore can't be comforted.
And is that the same as you cling to mum and kick her at the same time, or is that something different? Would that be the same as a child that clings to mum but also kicks her?
Yes, similar dynamic. Yeah, and in adulthood you see adult versions of this, of someone wanting to approach but will pull away, so the behaviours will be a sort of version of that implicitly encoded attachment state of mind.
Because it's got quite a lot of implications, hasn't it, for clinical work?
Yes, there are two main lines of research in attachment theory. One is the ones that I've just mentioned, which basically are exploring the transmission from parent to child of these states of mind or patterns of attachment. The other, more what people like Mikulince and Shaver are involved with, it's more to do with the social and cognitive aspects of attachment on a dimensional basis, to do with how adult romantic relationships are run. So on some sort of continuum, they would term this discomfort with intimacy, and the other end of that would be fear of abandonment and rejection. And on some continuum, we all have something of that, and then they explore the implications of that for adult romantic relationships. And I've found that in couple therapy to be extremely useful. I also see something of a gender bias towards females having more the preoccupied enmeshed fear of abandonment aspect, and men more towards avoidant.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose there are lots of ways you might think about that. Because I suppose one possibility is thinking about it in terms of projection, isn't it? Is that the woman is carrying his fear of abandonment as well as her own. Do you think that, are they mutually exclusive?
Yes, absolutely. And what, again, from an attachment theory perspective, which may fit into projection, projective identification, that these internal working models are imbued with predictions and expectations. So they come with sets of predictions and expectations, which can be completely distorted. But then you relate to the person from what you actually expect them to be like. I expect you to abandon me. I expect you to reject me. And that's what I see. Yes. And in some way, similar to Sandler's role reversal concept, I get you to play a role for my inner world. Yes. And you become an accomplice.
Yes, yes. And you can't, as you say, it sounds more or less coterminous with projection and projective identification.
I think they're very similar. Yes. So I think all of these things have similarities. It's just again that I think the language used from attachment is much more to do with a reflection of the research, and can it be couched in those ways so that we can put it onto an empirical basis. Yes. But I think it has lots of similarities
I think that's
with
right.
Other approaches.
Yeah. But what you also said when I asked you, when you said it's more accessible, that this language is more accessible to actual people who are struggling.
Not only the language, but also the lived experience of it. So when someone has a breakup, it can be linked to their history. when I worked in probation, I specialised in working with violent people, men and women. But what I saw, and I think you see it in everyday news, reports of women being killed. 2 women on average are killed each week by their, male partners or former lovers. Is that the man can't cope with the loss and acts out violently.
Yes, that the woman's most in danger when she tries to leave.
Absolutely.
Even though he's a violent
partner. One of my
partner.
workshops covers that. It's called Always Hurting the Ones You Love.
Yes.
Understanding intimate violence from an attachment and trauma perspective.
Yes. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I was thinking about, there are different ways of, again, thinking about that. Is there a space then, therefore, for the simple pleasures of sadism, you might put it? Is there? Or would you say that this that violence is always reactive?
Well, Bowlby would say that anger and extension of that into violence is not innate, as in the death instinct, that it is in reaction to a caregiver not being available. And I think if that's of a traumatic nature, which is what I saw with my clients in a forensic setting, that's implicitly encoded and is just waiting for a context to be unleashed.
Yes, because actually I'm a relational psychoanalytic therapist myself, but to try and put the balance but that is where they might diverge, isn't it? That an embracing, that an embracing of the death instinct might indicate one thing, whereas what you're describing is something much more from the lived experience. That the person has had this experience. Is it Coe who talks about love grown angry?
Yes.
Yeah, that the person has had this experience, and then through learning the attachment patterns very early in the first crucial 1001 days, takes it into every successive every successive encounter, and that it may look innate, but it's in fact not innate. Indeed.
It does posit a question really about cure.
Yes.
Is there a cure? I mean, I write in my book that I don't think there is a complete cure, but that great progress can be made via therapeutic relationship, looking at these sorts of things. But from my point of view, whatever we've experienced stays with us, is encoded, particularly in the limbic system.
Yes, the amygdala, that's part of the attachment theory, isn't it? Includes neuroscience. Yes,
neurobiology.
Yes, so it's encoded in our very DNA, or if not DNA, hardwiring?
Well, I think it does get hardwired and encoded into the amygdala in particular, which, is the fear centre of the brain.
Right.
And one of the things I say to parents of young children, try to protect your children from too much fear. Because once it's there, it's encoded, and it will come up and maybe get displaced or redirected, as Bowlby would say, onto something else.
Onto something else that ought not to be fearful, but then becomes fearful.
Yeah.
If you're being treated as the feared object, you may become. It may
come in your direction.
It may become in your direction. But also, I suppose, if the recipient is treated as the fearful object, they might. It might access frightening bits of themselves, mightn't it, in a way that being with somebody who isn't craven would not.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I suppose again I'm thinking about the aspect of projective identification, where the person projected into then identifies with the projection, so that everybody may have quite may have a cruel streak, but it will be called up by somebody who is expecting to be cruelly treated.
Absolutely. That fits in with some of the research about perpetrators, which shows that the perpetrators are afraid of their victims.
Yes.
And I think in that sense are projecting something into them.
Yes.
With regard to attachment theory and mentalization, which as we know informed Bateman and Thoniger's mentalization based, one of the things that Morris Eagle points out that I found useful to think about is that when people are working from these distorted internal working models, they are mentalizing, but what they're mentalizing can be a complete distortion, because it's coming from something that's got activated, which belongs too much to the past. So it's not that they don't mentalize, it's that what they're mentalizing can be a distortion.
It's already distorted, yes.
And this, I think, fits in with Mary Main's aspect of metacognition, that you have to reflect on and think about what you're mentalizing in a way to double check, not get locked into this is the only perspective I've got from this model.
Yes. So can you talk some more about the clinical work then with this? You've given a really clear.
Well, I think one of the things that it's so important to recognise when one's working with a client are these implicit procedural ways of functioning, which in essence are implicitly encoded memories. And the implicit memory system is perceptual, it's non-conscious. It's a sort of memory system we use, say, when we learn to drive a car. Initially, because we've got to think about which gear am I in, which pedal should I use to get off, where's the clutch, how do I steer this ruddy thing. Of course, once you've learnt to drive, it goes into implicit procedural memory. You just get in the car and drive off.
Yes, that's great. That's really clear, yes.
And it's not so different, say, with learning a musical instrument or singing. I mean, if I'm memorizing something in Russian, bloody hard work to start with until it's in there, and then hopefully I can, I've got the cue, the introduction on the piano, and I'm up and away. Well, it's no different with relationships. We learn how to do relationships via repeated patterns of interaction with our main caregivers. That gets structured into us. These internal working models, relational configurations, scripts, whatever terminology we want to use to conceptualize intrapsychic structure, they tend to be perpetuated and carried into adult relationships. So therapy is about seeing what someone is doing in this sort of automatic procedural way, both in interaction in the consulting room, but I think importantly in their everyday day life with their intimates. So in early stages of therapy, I will want them to keep a snag book and bring what is going on with their kids or their spouse or their workmates or whatever, so that then we can open their eyes to what they're doing procedurally, more for ill than for good. Then therapeutic action consists of them practicing something new and different. And of course that's linked into these developmental accomplishments of affect regulation and mentalization. Attachment theory can be viewed as a theory of affect regulation and theory of trauma, a trauma of separation and loss. And with that, these developmental accomplishments with parents who've got their own difficulties can't mirror and mark their child's affective states. So the child isn't very competent at knowing what they're feeling, becomes alexithymic or dissociative, and carries that into adulthood. And there's a huge cost to not being able to know and being acting out somatically, for instance. So psoriasis or gastric enteritis, whatever it may be, there can be a somatization, and violence is a way of acting.
Violence is a somatization, of course.
So it's helping someone see these things, but importantly, not keep doing it in the old way, because all that's doing is, in a way, strengthening the old models, but to help them to do something that's new and different that can feel terribly risky. But unless they do that and practice it, it's no different from learning to drive a car. Then they've got what Fonagy calls a second order internal working model built up alongside the old one, which I don't think you can get rid of.
Well, that goes back to what you said about cure, but you can have that.
You make a transition into something, whereas if there's nothing there, you're sunk. So in a stressful context, if the old model gets activated in certain circumstances, you may kill your partner.
Yes, that's that's such a dramatic enactment of something, isn't it?
I mean, it's obviously everything's on a continuum,
but that's the end of that's the.
And that's what I saw in my forensic work.
Can you talk a bit more about your forensic work? So I think people would be very interested.
Well, it's a long time since I worked in forensic. I've worked in private practice now for many years, but all I can say is that again,
It's on a continuum.
Yeah. Well, in one sense, yes. In another sense, no.
All right.
In forensic, mainly, my clients were mainly violent men, occasionally violent women. What I found in private practice is that where violence is concerned, it's mainly violent women who come to me.
Really?
And I think the phenomena of violence in females is underestimated. They don't get the help or the services they need. But yeah, what I mainly see is violence.
And do you think it's on the increase? Is it contextual? Or do you think it's really much more about it being acknowledged?
I think it's about being open to seeing it and getting maybe a little bit of distance from political correctness about whether this can be talked about or not. Obviously, male violence is off the scale, but I do see a lot of female violence too. And there's no point in same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relations. But there's no point in not acknowledging it.
Pretending it doesn't happen. No. So do you talk a bit more about how you do it then? Because I thought you began to sort of open up, finding out what the patterns are, and then practicing. I mean, it's really. I don't have some sort of agenda. I'm very open. I would describe myself as a relational psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Attachment theory is one aspect that informs my practice. Traumatology is, neuroscience is, so and obviously classical psychoanalysis. So I've integrated it into my own model that I describe it again in my book. So the process isn't very different from what I would see anyone working. But it's really getting the person to be curious about themselves, but feeling safe enough to explore. One of the main precepts of attachment theory is that there's got to be a safe enough, secure base and safe haven for the exploratory behavioural system to be available. And of course, with the avoidant child, this is what doesn't happen. So the avoidant child isn't helped to explore their inner world of thoughts, feelings, wishes, beliefs, desires and affects. And I've lost count of the amount of men in particular come to sessions saying, I think I'm autistic or I've got Asperger's. Came up last night actually in the seminar, the webinar I was doing. So they haven't been helped to explore their inner world. And of course, what I see too is this opposite seem to attract. I see repeatedly a woman who predominantly is preoccupied in emotion and a man who is predominantly avoidant, dismissing. And boy, do they, come together. And of course, their attachment needs and their intimacy needs aren't being met, and it becomes a very volatile, combustible, disappointing relationship. But presumably, they must have thought they were going to be met when they were attracted to each other.
Yeah, I think in the honeymoon period, the attachment dynamics go onto the back burner, and the lust and the passion of the sexual side predominates. Once that wanes, as inevitably it does over time, the attachment dynamics come to the forefront, and then you're getting something you didn't expect.
So that's a slightly different take, isn't it, from the deterministic, which sometimes psychoanalysts and analytic thinking is.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, that somehow you're like Henry Dix said, you always the man who wrote about marital tensions in the 50s said you always marry your mother.
Oh, I see.
That it's slightly that it is a slightly different take on the deterministic, isn't it?
Yes. No, I wouldn't see it in those lines. I don't think anyone has fully understood why there are these combinations of different attachment states of mind. But I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of couples I've worked with, or individuals at that matter, in a relationship, who haven't had this combination. Very occasionally you get two people who are preoccupied. Very, very rarely two people are avoidant, but mainly it's one person is preoccupied, the other is avoidant, dismissing. So I don't know what it is that they get out of each other. But of course, as the relationship goes on, they can become increasingly disappointed, and it can become increasingly fraught. Because generally the woman will want more closeness and intimacy, and the man will sort of withdraw from that and have distance regulators like golf or shed time or become work-centred.
Yes, have you read the Ladybird book of The Shed?
Right.
I recommend it.
And the more the woman chases and the man doesn't respond, what I see eventually is that woman gives up and then becomes avoidant herself. And it's at that point, it takes so much attachment cues to activate the man's attachment system, but only when he's faced with the loss does that get activated. And of course it may be too late, the love has died, and the woman saying, sorry, I've tried for years, you've never responded, so, or there's been a response and the man keeps falling back into the old pattern. It's a bit like a man who's a batterer, keeps promising next time, no, I won't do it.
Yeah, and presumably he keeps meaning it too.
Yes, until the next time something, and he's out of control.
Then he's out of control, yeah. And thinking you're saying that nobody knows why nobody's shown why necessarily these types
combinations
of combinations attract.
I don't think there's any real empirical understanding or evidence of it. It's just anecdotally, I can say over 25 years of working as a therapist and more, this is what I see repeatedly.
This is what you see. Because I suppose one theoretical explanation would be that they are repeating not only what has happened to them, but what they've seen.
Yes, I think we all have the couple in mind in that way that very often talked about. So that can be part of it. I think it is much more what has been introjected and internalised. But the other thing maybe to stress is that attachment relationships are relationship specific. So you can have, say, a child who's securely attached to one parent but disorganized with another parent. And
that then in relation with a different parent, an adult with a different person will evoke different
adult sort of dynamics, attachment dynamics rather.
And how does that explain the friend everybody's got who comes out of a ghastly relationship and then, guess what, 2 years later they've holed up with somebody very, very similar?
Well, I suppose one could see that in terms of Freud's repetition compulsion.
Well, yes, you could see it like that way.
If there's a trauma, I'm like a moth to a flame, I keep going back to it.
Well, I suppose the point about the repetition compulsion in that context is it's both it's familiar, but it's also, isn't it, an attempt at resolution?
Yes, and I think I like Mitchell's book called Hope and Dread in Psychoanalysis. I don't know whether you know it.
I don't know if I do, no.
Right. Published in 1993, Stephen Mitchell. But the hope is, I think, yes, I can go into this relationship, you're familiar enough for me to work something out. That's the hope. That's the dread is it's just going to be the bloody same as it always was. And too often it is, unfortunately. But I do think sometimes a good enough relationship can be a vehicle for change too, depending on the level of disturbance and trauma.
A good enough couple relationship.
Yeah, I think it can be healing, mutually so.
Thank goodness.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yes, because when we talk about it in this way, and I wanted to go back to you said that change and healing is possible.
Yes, not complete, and under certain levels of stress. I mean, one of the things I try to do in my work with clients is help them deal with higher levels of stress without the old models getting activated. Whereas with a lot of people, it just needs a little bit of stress and they're re-traumatized and they're in it. So, yes, depending on the level of stress, what gets activated. The other thing maybe to emphasise, so we're not too pessimistic, is that all the research shows, cross-culturally too, that 2/3 of the population are securely attached. 1/3 have these different combinations of avoidant or dismissing, and there can be cultural differences. For instance, in Israel, the predominance is of the ambivalent resistant child and preoccupied adult. Whereas in Germany, there's more of a predominance of more avoidant dismissing personalities or attachment states of mind.
God, you could have an awful lot of fun with that, couldn't you? Thinking about world situations.
And in the Handbook of Attachment, there's some interesting chapters on cross-cultural studies.
Gosh.
But yes, 2/3 of people are said to be relatively sorted.
Yes.
And we only see the casualties.
You only see the other third. It might be interesting to speculate about people, say, who run the country, where they fit in.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
The other thing that we didn't touch on in terms of the classification is that certainly in the AAI, in the strange situation, in the strange situation, it would be a disorganized, disoriented classification given when the child, on reunion, exhibits very bizarre behavior. So will bang their head or approach the parent backwards or circle around. So there's an irresolvable dilemma the child has got, which is generally about the parent being an abuser. So the strange situation and the AAI both are in a way designed to create enough stress for these attachment dynamics to become apparent. So the separation and staying with a stranger activates the attachment system and these different forms of behavioural responses to separation and reunion. So with the disorganized, disoriented child, what you're seeing is I need you, you know, because I'm now distressed, so I go to my attachment figure, but you're dangerous to me. So how can I come to you? So you get these bizarre behaviours of circling around or approaching backward or banging out.
Right.
In adulthood, it's termed unresolved with respect to loss and trauma. And these are always given as a super... they're given on top of the other, either secure or disorganized. Or preoccupied or avoidant. So the unresolved and the disorganized, in other words, don't stand alone.
Right.
They're always given as a supplementary to one of the others.
To one of the others, yes. What's running through my mind is the clinical implications of this, and thinking about, you know, your work, and you saying, well, you know, you try and help them think about what to do when the levels of stress are high. And I mean, I'd really be interested to know something. You know, how do you do that?
Well, in a way, it's just a part of the overall process. I mean, at times it might be that that you become much more explicit about it. But it is something that is going on in the relationship willy-nilly.
Yes.
So in terms of interactive regulation, that is going on willy-nilly on an implicit level. So,
do you mean towards you as the therapist? As the other?
So when, say, a person comes in a distressed state, part of what I'm doing is being that safe haven, secure base, helping them to access what they're talking about, but in that way, also on an implicit level, being available to them and regulating them. On a much more explicit level, I might say if say an avoidant man has been approached by his wife, an example was recently the wife wanted to talk to her husband about an emotional issue. She approached him in the kitchen, and he was looking out the window at the squirrels in the garden rather than being emotionally available to him. On other occasions, trying to solve her problem on a pragmatic, practical level without being emotionally available. So I might sort of say in very explicit terms what might need to happen and why it's not working, why she got angry. Maybe the best advice in the world, but if you haven't made that emotional connection to start with, it's not going to be heard and can't be used.
And do you think then that making these things explicit, can that make a change in him?
Again, only if he then starts to practice something. and has access to the feelings that are leading him to be avoidant and look out the window or try and solve something on a practical level. So I will help someone try to name what the emotional state is, and following Antonio Damasio, that all feelings and affects start as a visceral experience in the body.
Absolutely, feelings are physical.
You've got the enteric nervous system, which is the body's brain. So you've got a gut reaction and a gut feeling. Can that bodily experience be transformed by being symbolized, by using language? Is this FEAR, fear, or shame, or secular, whatever it may be? Can that be named and therefore reflected on and regulated? What I find with traumatized children who are now adult is that process, developmental process, has become seriously short-circuited. So it's not happening. And a developmental approach, which attachment theory is, and I think most approaches have a developmental element to them, would try to enhance these capacities of affect regulation and mentalization. So again, it's giving the person meaning for what they're experiencing, and also helping them to understand other minds by mentalizing. So I will always ask mentalizing questions. Why do you think they said that? Or why did they behave in that way? So to help them start to think, what do you think is in my mind at the moment? So never miss an opportunity to try and enhance their mentalization.
And inviting them to step outside a little bit and triangulate.
Absolutely. And I do talk about that there's the experiential self, where you're just in it, but you need to enhance a capacity for the observational self that stands outside. And I might explain that this is what I have to do as a therapist. I embed myself in your subjective experience, but there's a part of me that is observing what I'm doing that can disembed myself and use my theories and my clinical experience to maybe understand what's going on for me.
Yes, and that's what they need to learn to be able to do.
I think so.
Yes.
And I do go in for what some people might frown on, is psychoeducation. So I will share with them my way of working and the framework and the research that underpins it. And I try to help them have that framework of understanding and use it in their everyday life.
But but psychoeducation is completely congruent with where you started. How are people to learn to do something differently without the information?
Absolutely.
You're talking about infants and small children who've never been given the information that this body reaction means this emotion.
Exactly.
Yes.
And to start with, especially with people who are highly alexithymic or dissociative, you might have to name the emotions for. I've lost count with people who are like this when I ask, what were you feeling in that moment? That they come back with a cognition.
Tell you what they thought. Yes.
And they can't, it just shows that they're not in touch with their emotion. And that's a huge part of what you need to help them to do. To have some sort of emotional language for their experience and some sort of meaning.
Well, I suppose, whatever your theoretical framework, I think we could probably all subscribe to things which can be put into words don't usually need to be acted out.
No, exactly. Where it gets tricky is that I think this came up last night in our webinar, that we function in three main domains. The cognitive, verbal, reflective domain, which is characterized by autobiographical and episodic memory. So we are aware and conscious of what has happened to us, and we can reflect on that and speak about it. The implicit procedural domain, which is an active domain, which the autobiographical memory doesn't have access to. So it's our way of remembering is by doing, by acting, whether it's driving a car or whatever we're remembering. How we can't necessarily talk about it. We can't talk about how I've come to relate to people in these ways. It's just implicitly encoded, and now I do it. But it is trying to make, in a way, the implicit explicit, just as Freud would argue, making the unconscious conscious. Which brings me on to the third domain, which is the domain of the dynamic unconscious, which is characterized by repression. But in terms of development, brain development in particular, the infant is born with the systems of the brain available which support implicit procedural memory, maybe for evolutionary purposes, because they have to be able to experience fear and signal fear to be protected.
Yeah.
But not with the systems of the brain that support autobiographical memory. This is why Freud, I think, talked about infantile amnesia, and why, you know, we can't remember very little when we're 2 or 3, and even a little bit, you know, up to 5 or 6. So there's no access to traumas that are pre-verbal and before those systems of the brain have developed. So an awful lot of people are coming with experiences that are to do with early life, and these patterns of attachment we talked about laid down by 12 months of life. So you can have a traumatized, disorganized child who would have no access to what has gone on and no meaning of it. So then it's a matter of co-creating something and using our theory and our research to try and help someone have meaning for what has happened without it turning into recovered memory sort of therapy.
Territory, yes.
Because you can't recover these memories. You can only co-create something. You
can't recover the memories. You can only find out something about what's encoded inside and co-create possibilities.
Absolutely. Yes. And the best way of sort of saying that something traumatic must have happened is how the person is behaving now. And what sort of attachment state of mind they've got, and how they can experience relationships in a traumatic way. My first client this morning, relatively new client, in a gay relationship, lesbian relation, her partner only has to look at another person and she has a panic attack and, you know, is on that person's case and is sabotaging the relationship. So, you know, with her history I can understand where that comes from. So that's an emotional memory of a fear of
bodily memory.
So an emotional and bodily memory of the trauma, but there's no access to it from autobiographical memory. So this is why it gets so tricky about how then do you work with it. And I think it's also why a lot of therapists make the mistake of jumping onto, excuse me, oh, it must have been childhood sexual abuse then.
Yes.
Because if you haven't got this framework of understanding, you will try and latch on to some big trauma.
Yes. But what you're saying
is, you can be completely wrong.
It may not be that at all. Yes.
And then, of course, as we know, you may actually instill a memory in someone that's completely inaccurate.
So that's a really clear explanation of how false memories are come by, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because they're not the evil doings of either the therapist or the client. No. They are, that's the search for meaning.
Yes, so it becomes something represented internally that the therapist, either wittingly or unwittingly, has sort of instilled in the person, imbued them with.
Because I think what you're saying is, well, it could be that, but it could be anything. Well, you'll never know, but you know it's there.
Yes, and the best that we can do is that something has gone wrong, because how you are in attachment and trauma terms. And, that's the best evidence that something has gone wrong relationally, developmentally for you, and therefore inform what your early attachment and intersubjective experiences were likely to have been, and therefore inform how we need to work with you.
Yeah. That's that's a cooperative, co-constructed, collaborative way of working, yes. And presumably the things signally missing from the experience of these traumatized people that find their way to you.
Say again,
So the collaborative way of working presumably has been missing from the experience of the people who found their way to you.
No, absolutely. The skein is why in the adult attachment interview you get this concept of earned secure, where
concept of, say again?
Earned secure. Someone can be classified as earned secure and they are thus classified if they have a history of abuse and trauma, but their discourse style is collaborative and coherent, and they can talk with the interviewer and tell their story in a coherent way. They would be classified, despite their history of trauma and abuse, as earn secure, whether it's through therapy or a good enough relationship we talked about earlier. Something has happened for them to make that shift.
So that's the theory, that's implicit in your theory base, that something has happened, rather than, you know, some people are born much more robust than others?
Well, I think that is the case, and of course children are born with a temperament, but not with these personality traits.
Not with these personalities, and not with the capacity to form those, the memories that you were talking about earlier.
They are an emergent property of a relational matrix, I would say.
That's a very fine phrase, isn't it? But it's absolutely, It's an emergent property of a
relational matrix.
A relational matrix. Can you open that up for somebody who doesn't quite know what it means?
Well, I would see this as why I don't subscribe to the Freudian Oedipus complex and the way that sexuality develops. Again, I wouldn't see that as compelling explanation for a person's sexual development.
Could you, I mean, I'm really interested to, you know, I know that you lecture about it. Could you talk some more about what you think about?
Well, just on that point of view, that someone's sexuality would again be an emergent property of the emotional quality and psychological aspect of their family of origin, rather than there being this sort of universal complex that has to be worked through. I don't find that.
You don't find that convincing?
I do think that triangular relationships, the various combinations of triangles in a person's family of origin, can be very powerful and then be projected out and played out in their adult relationships. But I think that's very different from saying there is this universal.
Yes,
and it doesn't work for gay people.
No, well,
and it's very tenuous working for females as well.
That's interesting actually, because I think maybe even the Oedipus complex is being revisited. Bernard Rattigan, you may have known, was researching before he was sadly taken from us too soon. As Bernard's view was, it was a Freudian. Bernard's view was that you cannot have a resolution of the Oedipus complex without a homosexual aspect. And the Oedipus complex is neutral on the subject of sexuality or homosexuality.
I don't think anything that's generalised and universalised in that way
is going to be any help. It's going to be helpful.
It fits in with the relational psychoanalytic concept that Jessica Benjamin, Lou Aaron, and others talk about, the psychoanalytic third, or the relational third.
Say some more, yes.
So you've got two unique subjects. They come together, and again, something unique is an emergent property of those two unique people joining together. And that property, that emergent property, is often called, I prefer the term relational third rather than psychoanalytic third, but something emerges that is unique to that couple. And I think that's, you know, a more helpful way of looking at it from a hermeneutic point of view, of looking at a person's subjective experience, rather than trying to pin some sort of grand theory onto people, like an Oedipus complex or the death instinct. It's all intrapsychic innate things of, you know, dual instinct of aggression and sexuality. That, for me, that doesn't work. And I think attachment theory and relational psychoanalysis challenges some of those precepts of a more classical approach.
But it doesn't work for you, and what you said, what you realised was it wasn't going to work for your clients either, that you couldn't.
That's certainly what I found when I went into probation. That attachment theory, I mean, I see attachment theory, and I've just edited a special issue on attachment and psychoanalysis for the Psychoanalytic Inquiry Journal.
Oh, yes, I saw that, yes.
And, you know, I do think that what I found there was that there is a much more sort of a convergence between these approaches, and the view that attachment theory is a psychoanalytic perspective.
Oh, sure.
And I think it's a helpful way of viewing it.
Yeah.
So my practice is informed by a lot of Freudian and Kleinian thinking, but I think you've got to pick and choose.
Yes. But not so much informed by the technique. I think that's what you're saying.
No.
That you have an adapted technique which takes those into account. But
Yeah.
and that's, I mean, I think that's what the people looking at this are going to want to know more and more about.
Yeah.
Because how you manage these complex situations, or how to keep an open mind without your brains falling out.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think in terms of technique, informed by infant research, is to work face-to-face, for instance.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, because of course classically psychoanalytic work is done on the couch.
No, exactly. So I think, and it's often said that it developed that way because Freud couldn't bear to be looked at all day. So he devised, but then it becomes, a stereotypical way of work. Yeah, yes. Exactly. But I think, again, neuroscientists would say there are certain aspects of the brain that develop early that are specially designed to read faces.
Yes.
This is where we get most of our meaning.
Yes, that's certainly known from infant research, isn't it? Yes.
On a very subtle level, that when it's out of conscious awareness, but we're monitoring and reading faces all the time. So if we're not seeing each other's faces, all right, using the couch if you can see each other. My supervisor uses the couch, but she's sitting in sight.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Not behind.
Not behind. Yeah. So in that way, it's a bit of a side issue. Might you think that Skype therapy would, because you can see each other.
Yes.
You're not embodied. You're not your bodies aren't there, but actually you have got your faces there. That gives another perspective on.
It does.
Skype
Interestingly,
therapy.
I don't like Skype and I don't do it, but I do telephone. I've got people in all parts of the world: Malaysia, New York, Texas, Switzerland, and we have telephone sessions.
But you can't see each other.
I can't see each other.
Yes.
But we have worked together before their work has taken them abroad.
Yes.
I generally don't, although there is a supervisee in Utah who I've never met face to face, but that's a supervisee. Otherwise, I have met the people and worked with them quite at length. So in a way, I wonder whether it's similar to people who are blind and have heightened other senses, whether something compensates, because you pick up something.
Yes.
We may not be seeing each other, but you pick up. You could argue, well, that goes for the person sat behind the couch then.
Oh well, I'm not. You could, but I think these are. These are things to explore, aren't they? But what you're saying is that the face-to-face work, you think, has something very specific about very early development and the need.
I think, and also
to see the face, because we're looking at each other, and we're not sitting back to back. We want to do this together, so we're looking at each other. Yes.
Yes. But not only early development, also what needs to be done from a developmental perspective in the current relationship. So the interactive regulation I'm talking about. Also trust. The person can see me and maybe read me and can trust be engendered, so exploration can continue.
So it's not just that that related to the early experience of wired for face recognition. You think it's part of the therapeutic process?
I would say so. So you've got to adapt your technique, especially with people who've had some form of trauma and who hasn't, who comes into therapy. And I think some of the techniques of a more classical approach with some people can actually be iatrogenic.
That causes more therapist-induced problems. Yes.
Because it can, replicate some sort of trauma and not
re-traumatise, yes, because that was something I was going to ask you about in terms of working with traumatised people and hearing about the trauma and the concept of vicarious re-traumatisation. And I hadn't expected to get to it from this route.
Right.
That's the risk a classical analyst or psychoanalytic psychotherapist might run. Yeah. But it's the same. Yeah, it's the same department, isn't it? The re-traumatisation. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Well, Judith Herman, you probably know, writes about it in her book Trauma and Recovery. I think it very much depends on how resilient the therapist is themselves. If they themselves have got a history of being vulnerable to picking up in terms of intergenerational transmission of trauma from traumatized parents, fearful parents. They may be more vulnerable when the trauma comes up in a therapeutic session with a particular client. So, but someone hopefully like me is a bit more resilient, a bit more robust. 22 years in the British Army, 14 years working with offenders before I came into therapy. I feel I'm pretty robust, and that I can hear people's trauma stories and I invite them to tell us. And I think the client needs to know that you are a good container, provide a holding environment and can hear their story. So actually, my first session is an assessment session, which may again be a technique that is different from a more psychoanalytic one, where you just see what emerges. I will actually take a trauma history, an attachment history, a sexual relationship history.
So that you've got the land mapped out at least in your mind.
Yes, I think it's so helpful to have that context, to help understand what is creating difficulties in living now.
But presumably for the patient or client too, you think that contextualises it for them.
I think it gives a message, I can hear your story.
Yes, yeah. And for them to repeat their story or to relive their story, do you think that there are dangers in that?
Well, I think if they feel that there's a secure enough base there to explore, it's not going to faze them.
That's really, yes. So that's what you were saying.
If they feel the therapist can't cope with this.
Yes.
And Gabbard talks about the same thing with the erotic trance.
Yes, I would like to come on to that, yes.
Right. That if the client is picking up, you can't deal with my eroticism, I better close it down then.
Yes. Yeah.
So same with trauma. If you can't deal with my trauma, I'll keep it to myself. Yes. And in that way, that may be a reenactment of what happened in their earlier relationship.
The thing that obviously comes to mind is childhood sexual abuse, isn't it? Where there's an abuser and somebody who's not hearing.
Yes, no, exactly. But also a dynamic that I must be your full self then. I must adapt and conform to what you can cope with, just as I had to adapt and conform to what my mother could cope with, say, or my father could cope with, and become your full self. So if that's how the therapy gets off the ground, once those patterns are established, they become very tricky to change.
Yes. Well, that's been a thread running through everything you've talked about so far, hasn't it? That established patterns are very difficult to change.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't stop with the first 1001 critical days.
No.
That continues all through life.
Yeah, and of course once those patterns are there, they can tend to get, if we can't see them as therapists, replayed with us. So we need to be aware of these sort of issues and tailor our approach accordingly. The other thing, of course, is more self-disclosure of the countertransference, and generally it's a more intimate relationship, more collaborative.
So the self-disclosure of the countertransference, can you link that up with the need for the patient or client to understand they have a robust therapist?
I think that can be part of it, yes. Yeah. Also, a very important part of it is what we call, again, comes from partly cohort but also infant research, rupture repair cycle.
Yes.
That all relationships will have disruptions or ruptures to them. That's not the point. The point is what do you do with it. What do you do with it, yeah. So again, it fits in with attachment research. It's not that the mother or the caregiver has to be the perfect mother, but good enough in the Winnicottian terms that when things go wrong, the child has a confident expectation it can be put right and be repaired. Yes. And whether it's a parent-child that generates security or whether it's something in the therapeutic relationship, I can trust you. We can look at these things. We can talk about them, put them right. Yes. We can have our misunderstandings or, I might get it wrong. And a powerful thing that I find almost invariably leads the client to cry is when I put my hand up and say, sorry, I got that wrong.
Yes, and that's what you're talking about
that can be part of self-disclosure.
Self-disclosure, that you got it wrong and together you can now
put it right.
Put it right, yeah.
And also how I say that there are three main things that all relationships need, and mainly these come from attachment theory. Safe haven, secure base functions, which just means that, you know, there's a safe haven to go to when you're feeling distress. It needs to be one way with parent and child, but in an adult relationship, two way. So if one person's distressed, they need the other person to be their safe haven. If that person can respond by being emotionally available, responsive and supportive, they become the secure base from which the person can go away and get on with life and explore. The other is what we've just talked about, rupture repair. That ruptures aren't just left to fester or swept under the carpet. They can be repaired in a timely way. And all these things are interlinked, but the last one is good, emotionally meaningful communication.
Yes, that's. I think that's very helpful for the people who are going to be looking at these DVDs, who are, you know, maybe beginning in their career or wanting some other perspective. We can't have a conversation with them, but they want to know, you know, how you do it, and I think that's really. Put that. So
I'm very aware of that's what I need to do in my relationship with a client, but also what I help them to see they need to do in their everyday relationships. Can I pick up a couple of sort of more specific things? Because I wondered about. I mean, this is obviously more of a psychoanalytic language, and we might need to translate it. But what I wondered about was sometimes in trauma, there's a kind of it becomes the repeat of it and the talking about it and the reliving it and other people hearing it becomes in some way libidinized activity. The people can start to get off on it. And I was thinking particularly about groups of offenders, sexual offenders who have group therapy, and that I think it's very tricky, isn't it, for the therapist to prevent actually everybody getting very excited about this. So I think in all trauma that must be a tightrope somewhere, isn't it, for the. Well, it depends how you work with the trauma, you see.
Well, that's what I wanted you to add.
You seem to be assuming with that question that there's a focus on the trauma all the time, whereas I don't work in that way. I will know what the trauma is, but then I will work globally or holistically with the person to try and strengthen various capacities so that they can cope when they are re-traumatized. So it's not always talking about the trauma.
Well, I think that's really helpful to people. You know, people thinking about how to work with patients and clients who come to them with or trauma appears, and how to know, well, no, the point isn't just to keep hearing about it, but to contextualize it and to help the person have some resources to deal with when they're inevitably, I suppose you'd say, would be re-traumatized.
Exactly.
Yes.
So yes, I think it can be counterproductive to keep coming back to the trauma and focusing.
Yes, I think that's really
that way. It's not an approach I use. And the group work you talk about with sex offenders, that would be from a CBT angle. I never found that how. I work from a psychodynamic perspective.
Well, I have to say I always thought it was a big mistake myself. I haven't done it, but obviously I've heard about people doing it. But take it on to the area of the erotic transference and the erotic countertransference, because I think what you were saying was really helpful, that in both cases the patient or client has to know you're up to the job. You can manage the feelings, not deny them, but not get carried away by them. So I thought it would be really interesting if you could expand on that and talk perhaps a bit about your experiences and how that
Well, I mean, funnily enough, this was the webinar I was doing last night, and the third of my 3 discussion papers was a case vignette of how I dealt with a woman, a female client, who wanted to have sex with me. My point is that there's no standardized way of dealing with another person's sexuality. So it has to be, again, an emergent property of that relationship. So you may have the same issue with another client, but engage with it in a very different way. But when this woman disclosed, you know, that she wanted to have sex with me, that she'd been thinking about that, she wanted to have dinner with me, she'd been to an excursion with her husband, she wished it was with me. I sort of entered into an as if play mode, saying that, had we met under different circumstances, I might have wanted to go for a coffee for you, or have supper with you, or go for a romantic weekend to York with you, or I might, wonder what it's like to have sex with you. So in that way, I could validate her desires as a woman without crossing a boundary. But it made an emotional connection with her. Then we could laugh together about sharing a weekend away together in York, knowing it was never going to happen, but that could be worked with and talked about. There was some language to talk about her desire for me, with a playful hint that I might have similar feelings for her without saying explicitly, I might want to go to bed with you too.
And what about then the thinking about, say, one possibility is that this is a defence, that she's talking about having about sex because she doesn't want another kind of intercourse.
And that's what I made clear in the paper, that sexualising the relationship was her way of avoiding attachment trauma,
that's what
separation and loss.
If you could link it up
so she has a very, when she started, even from the word go, was you're going to die on me, you're going to retire, you're going to change career, I'm going to lose you. And with her history, I could see that, and in her country of origin, shortly after she left East European country, her previous therapist died. So her whole childhood and adulthood was imbued with fear of loss and actual losses. And I think then the sexual system can be activated, is what Giovanni Liotti talks about. The agonistic system, motivational system characterized by violence, the attachment system itself, the caregiving system, which can be used compulsively to avoid attachment, and the sexual system. So quite often what I find is that people will sexualize a relationship as a way of avoiding getting in touch with what's really bothering them.
I do think that's really helpful because in another language, if you're a therapist and somebody has a negative transference to you, you think it's transference, and if they have a positive transference to you, you tend to think they've got good taste. And really what you're saying is, that you found a way of playing with it without boundary violation, which is actually very difficult. It'd be interesting to talk some more about that. Because of course the therapist who equally puts up no entry defences and say, we don't talk about that.
No.
Is equally, presumably, not able then to explore something that the patient needs to work through.
Absolutely. What my webinar on sexuality is about too is the taboo subject of the therapist's attraction for the patient, which isn't talked about enough.
No, absolutely.
And there's a gap in the training, and the research shows that I cite in my webinar that it's pretty widespread.
Well, you just thought it would be normal.
Exactly. But people don't get help with it because it seems it can't be talked about on training, on people's trainings, and there's a gap in helping people deal with that side of it, their own erotic attraction to their client. And of course, when it's mutual, it's so important for, as Gabbard says, the only difference between love in real life and love in the therapeutic relationship, that in the therapeutic relationship, the role and function of the analyst to analyse what's going on needs to be there, which isn't there in real life. So there's a real relationship that is new and different, as well as a transference relationship.
Well, that's really interesting as well, I think, for people to think about, because people do become anxious in the grip of an erotic transference and counter-transference, don't they? Because I think what you're saying is, one way of thinking about it is the patient can't be in love with you, want to have sex with you. She doesn't know you. She only knows this part of you that but she sees through her lens of attachment, but also the you that presents in the consulting room and not the you that
this is where it gets tricky too.
But
that there is a real relationship as well.
Well, that's, I think, important. That's the point I thought you were making.
Yeah, that we may think that we're not disclosing something because we're not explicitly saying, but we're disclosing all the time because how we are, what we might say, how we look.
Yes.
So there's a real relationship as well as a transference relationship. So it's both a real falling in love and a new experience, and also unreal because it's something from the past that is being transferred on.
Yes.
But the same goes for the therapist, you see. So again, Gabbard talks about Sandler's role responsiveness. Although the client may be getting the therapist to play a role from their inner world, the role that the therapist takes on will be influenced by his or her own wishes, beliefs and desires and attachment and trauma history. And of course, as we know, maybe we should talk about this, different forms of love.
Oh, it'd be good, yes.
What we're talking about in this context is lustful love. There's romantic love, there's transient love, and there's attachment love.
Right.
So Joe Lichtenberg delineates these different forms of love in a helpful way. So when the therapeutic relationship is characterized by lustful love, it's much more dangerous, especially if it's mutual, for a boundary to happen, a boundary violation to happen, and for the therapeutic role and function to get overwhelmed. And sometimes for the therapist to profess love to the client. Sometimes the client will be frightened off, but other times be flattered.
Yes.
And also go into a caregiving role for the therapist, which may include, okay, I'll have sex with you if that's what you want. I'll look after you in these ways.
So all the time you're talking about it, you're interweaving the attachment situation, the false self caregiving situation with the an adult sexual situation that I think you're indicating in every way. These are not divisible.
No, these attachment states of mind and motivational systems, they're often called, I would say are interlinked. Some people see the attachment system and the sexual system as being separable. I think they're interlinked.
Yes. So we started with lustful love, and so what? I mean, what do you have an idea about what stimulates lustful love? Is it ineffable?
Well, I mean, sometimes I've experienced this myself. Say with a work colleague, when I worked in probation, I was objectively a very attractive woman that I had no lustful or erotic interest in, except the more I saw her, a few years down the line, I really fancied her and we had a relationship. So that can happen in therapy. So something can grow up because of the intimacy of it. It's a very intimate and therefore risky business. And that something can grow up that wasn't there originally, but can develop into an erotic relationship with lustful love. Cilenza, who writes a lot about therapists who cross boundaries, says a perennial question in therapy is, why can't we be lovers? And that needs to be answered. It won't come up in all therapies, and quite often some will be much more characterised by attachment love, which is characterised by warmth, security, companionship, safety.
Yes.
But these different forms of love, romantic love, I mean, Freud talks about family romances, that can come up, and of course transient love. Am I really, is this relationship more characterised by transient love? That I had for a parent or for a brother who sexually abused me, or whatever it may be, am I now transferring that onto you? But also enacting something with you.
And what's the therapeutic task then with all these different sorts of love that you might encounter in the consulting?
I think in essence to be able to talk about them. And this again is what the research shows, that because of the gap in training, when these things come up, it can lead to the sort of premature ending of the therapeutic relationship, because the therapist doesn't know how to talk about it, can be judgmental, moralistic, and that can lead to the ending. So you need to be able to talk about these things without acting them out and crossing a boundary violation.
So we're back to things that can be put into words.
Absolutely.
Yes, totally.
And contained in that way.
Contained in that way. Yes, because you mentioned holding and containment. We've been thinking about that earlier, about the similarities and differences, because actually you're describing both, aren't you? You're describing a holding environment which is safe and secure, and a containing process, as it were, where things are spoken about and you process them in your mind in order to give the client some security that this, and modelling that this can be articulated.
And of course, when there is
about.
an intense, lustful love, especially if it's mutual, that will really challenge the dyad in how to manage that. Because, you know, these are such powerful feelings.
Say a bit more?
Well, just that they are, you know, I desire you, I want you, I've got to have you.
Yes, it's very Woody Allen, isn't it?
Yes, in a way.
Yeah.
And, you know, then it can get almost sort of addictive and masturbatory, that the couple talk about, you know, what's going on almost in a masturbatory way.
Yes, talk about having sex.
Yes, without maybe actually. But as Gabbard said, it can be a slippery slope.
And it's still, as it were, a perversion of the therapeutic endeavour. Then is that what you say?
Well, if it
becomes a masturbatory activity, even if it's not acted out in a bodily sense. Yeah. Well, as I say, I do think people are really very preoccupied and concerned about how they manage these things, and it isn't much talked about.
No, and this is what Ravi and I found last night with the webinar on sexuality. A lot of people were writing in questions and saying, don't give my name out. Yes. I want to remain anonymous.
Yes,
and there was it struck me quite a lot of anxiety about being able to talk about these things, even in a webinar. I've got to remain anonymous. But quite an interest in it, of course.
Yes. And do you think the different sorts of love are contingent on the early attachment patterns?
I think just about everything we do as adults is mediated by our predominant attachment state of mind, particularly in intense, intimate relationships. That, you know, in one way or another, it's never linear. It's some sort of new edition of an old storyline, if you like, but with enough similarity to fit. And I think that again is why people get drawn to one another.
Yeah.
This might be a much more suitable person for me. I'm not interested in him. If I can use the term, you're fucked up enough for me to play out some of my troubles with you, so I'll go with you.
Yes. Yeah, how often have we seen that?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, or not to mention lived it, I'm sure. But so that I was thinking about again the repetition compulsion, and whether part of the meaning of what people construct in their adult lives is not only about their own attachment patterns, but about what they have, as it were, seen around them. So that it's
where that gets tricky for me is then you're talking about the verbal reflective conscious domain, and I don't think that has such power over us. Can
you verbal reflective conscious domain?
That we talked about these three domains a little earlier. That is much more the conscious domain that I don't think has such power over us in terms of our personality and what we reenact as the implicit procedural domain.
Yes, but what about something like intergenerational trauma then? Where does that belong?
Well, the intergenerational trauma again gets implicitly encoded and then is acted out in those ways. It's not so dissimilar to, say, symptoms of PTSD. You know, it's gone into implicit procedural memory. So I hear a car backfire and I'm back on the battleground.
Yes, of course.
It's not real, but that's how I experience it.
Yes. And when we go back to what you said earlier, which is that you'll never that never gets reprogrammed.
You can never have access to it.
Because you can't get access to it. Yes. So you can't, as it were, develop a new neural pathway.
Well, you can.
But you can't erase the old one.
You can't erase the old one. But from a neuroscience point of view, what we're doing by having, say, a new challenging relationship is making new connections.
Yeah.
So people like Edelman talk about neural Darwinism. You know, that new neural connections are made as a result of new challenging experiences. So those new connections built up are the neurological substrate of what we then conceptualize psychologically as an internal working model or an object relationship. So that's the best we can do, but the old connections or models stay.
Stay, yes. So
there's something happening in the brain as a result of a new relationship.
Which may... If practiced enough, to go back up to a word you used at the very beginning, may be able to get stronger. But
well, that's the point.
Yeah.
Those neural connections need strengthening. They can only be strengthening by repeatedly doing something. This is Damasio's point. So, if you're not practicing in that way, you know, people often talk about a genius putting in 10,000 hours to be able to be a brilliant pianist. Whether you become a brilliant pianist or not, if you're not putting the hours to practice something new, it ain't going to happen. So I often say to people, unless you go out into the world and practice what I'm telling you, you're wasting your time and money.
Yes, but if they, in another way, if they only learn that you can do this with them, they've not learned anything of value. They have to learn to take it somewhere.
They have to take it out and practice.
Yes.
And often it is, I mean, as an ongoing piece of homework, I will say, try to monitor what is going on for you bodily and try to name that as an emotion, contextualize it, reflect on it, maybe make links to your childhood. Where does it come from? And that is enhancing affect regulation and mentalization.
And that's, of course, presumably what was missing from their actual childhood.
Absolutely.
That whole process of feeling the feelings, naming the emotion, and finding out what's caused it.
That all therapies need to have this developmental aspect to it.
So would you say then that a classical psychoanalytic approach, untempered with, which I'm not sure hardly anybody does anymore, but untempered by more modern research into these kinds of, into attachment and into something more relational?
It's a tricky one, because what all the research shows, whether it's again Gabbard and Hobday or people like Shedler, Fonagy, Roth and Fonagy, but you know, what works. All the findings seem to show that it is the actual relationship is the main vehicle to change.
Yes, it's so actually, even with, I was talking earlier, even with the other manualised treatments, the papers... If
there is a good enough relationship.
Yeah, the papers, actually it's often it's one or two therapists, and what is actually being measured is therapist effect.
The jury's out a little bit, so you can argue, and it has been argued, there's an equivalence of outcome, regardless of the therapeutic approach and theoretical approach used. But what also the research seems to show, say, comparing CBT with a more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach, is that CBT can be effective initially, but doesn't change intrapsychic structure in the way that a more longer-term psychodynamic approach has the potential to do. And without that more something in place that can be taken forward, which research seems to show, the other stuff falls away.
Yes, well, that is the research, isn't it? But that's exactly congruent with what you've been saying about the work. The therapeutic work is about really reprogramming something,
yeah.
so that the person has that insight that they can take it into the next stressful situation. Yeah?
Yes, and maybe not only insight, because what I say to people, again, like the analogy of learning to drive a car, you need to bring focal attention to bear on the task to start with until it's there, and then you don't need to think about it.
Yeah.
Ideally, it's the same with doing relationships in a new and positive way. It's hard work to build up these new mental models and practice it, and taking risks and doing something new and different that can feel very dangerous and goes against the grain. But if you practice it and then it becomes encoded in implicit procedural memory as a new model, you just do it.
You'll get used to it, yes.
So you don't have to think it's an insight, you're just doing it. You don't have to think on that level at all.
You don't have to
You're
think.
just
What
doing
would Paul have
something new.
said? It's part of you then.
Yeah. What I very often, in terms of the process of change, what I very often find with clients is that it takes some way for these subtleties of change to happen, and they're not aware of them because it is so subtle and nuanced. But some way down the line, they look back and say, I feel differently and I'm doing these things differently. And that is a sign that there's some form of earned security occurring, and that a new model is in place, and that it can deal with higher levels of stress without the old ones getting. So these are signs of change.
Well, I think we were going to pause in a minute for have a break, but I think we might, if we can think about starting up with, summing up with what you've said about the therapeutic task and the requirement of the therapist, because what you've been talking about has been a lot about where you need to be and what you need to think about, as well as, and then from there comes technique.
Yeah, and just, to carry that forward, what I see with an awful lot of therapists, which is a lack, is that they lack an understanding of what the process of change consists of.
Well, that would be a really good place to start again, wouldn't it? What does the process of change consist of? Because the great thing about these all these seminars and things are that they're practically based for people to be helped with their clinical work. So I think it would be a really good place to start back about what is the process of change consist of.
Not sure I can answer it, but we'll start with it.
We'll start with that. We'll have a conversation.
Okay.
So we were going to talk a bit about the process of change. You had some ideas you could share about it.
Well, I'm very influenced by the Boston Change Process Study Group. Daniel Stern's work before he died a couple of years ago, but it's ongoing. Not only because, like many other approaches, mentalization approach or mother-infant psychotherapy, it's informed by attachment theory.
Yes.
And his concept of implicit relational knowing, IRK, is very much about implicit memory and something that is going on that level. And I like his concepts of now moments and moments of meeting. I don't know whether you're au fait with any of that.
I certainly know about moments of meeting, but know the rest of it.
So the intersubjective aspect,
yes.
Again, very informed by developmental studies, baby watching, as it's often called, and sort of the intersubjective aspect, he would say, following, I can't think of his name, Trevathan, that there are three aspects of intersubjectivity. The key word is shared. So shared interest, shared attention, shared intention, and shared emotions. So again, that is something I think that goes wrong for people who are traumatized and haven't had attuned caregivers, and it's something that one needs to try and bring into a therapeutic relationship. How can we have the all-important emotional connection by having a shared interest, shared attention, shared emotion, and how can you build that into your life?
Yes.
But in broader terms, yes, I think we do need to have some sort of framework that gives us a meaning for how do people change, what is it that we need to do, and what are the theoretical and therapeutic methods that we need to bring to bear and have some sort of understanding. What is it that we do that leads to change? And as I say, I find that a lot of people don't seem to have that. And the framework that we've been talking about, helping someone become a more competent self by enhancing affect regulation, mentalization, seeing these implicit procedural patterns of interaction, making those much more visible. My book is called The Silent Past and the Invisible Present: Memory, Trauma and Representation in Psych. So how can we make what is silent and invisible, which is what implicit procedural memory consists of, how can we bring that to the forefront so someone can see it?
And where then would you locate, or would you not, the psychoanalytic interpretation?
Well, that's interesting, and again you talk about Chris Kluler and the paper he wrote for my journal edition is about more the implicit relational aspect that challenges to some degree the interpretative side. But I would say it's a dual process, that you need both. This is where I take a little bit of issue with the Boston Change Process Study Group, who do put forward this view that change can happen without it being verbalized. Because I think of my experience with severely traumatized people in a forensic setting, I don't go with that. I think it might be enough if the trauma isn't so intense, and that would be the more relational, but I think it needs that psychoeducational bit as well, and more towards maybe the insight aspect. So it's both something that is going on an implicit interactional level, relational, that needs to be verbalized and seen, as well as informing the person of what my therapeutic frame is, so that they can use that and take that away too.
And where are you on Strachey's ideas of the mutative interpretation then?
Well, it's a bit dated now, I would say. It goes back quite a way. And I would say that there's an awful lot more going on.
So that you're saying that interpretation of the unconscious conflict or drive may have a place in a good to lead to a good therapeutic outcome, but on its own, it cannot function without all the other things that you've said.
I suppose it's what we were talking about, that these three levels of functioning. Clearly, there will be something that is repressed into the dynamic unconscious, and therefore will need some sort of interpretation on a more cognitive, verbal, reflective level. But so much of what drives a personality informs our personality, and what someone is doing that they're not seeing is much more to do with the implicit procedural. I think Freud was talking without it being seen in these lights when he talked about primal repression other than secondary repression. That this is something that is pre-verbal and can't be talked about. And I think Winnicott was talking about this when he talked about primitive agonism. Bion was talking about it when he talked about nameless dread. I think it's been conceptualized, but it wasn't until relatively recently that implicit procedural memory was discovered.
So that the,
and been theorized.
So with infant research and observational studies, that something could be shown.
Well, also the neuroscientific and other people, memory researchers, have brought this much forward. But I think psychoanalysts were talking about it in one way or another. But not quite getting. I think Winnicott was ahead of his time with his final paper, Fear Breakdown. And again in my book I talk about the importance of that, and what is going on there is something that is known but not remembered. And this is what we mean I think Bollas talks about it as the unthought known.
The unthought known, yes.
Yeah, there's a personal idiom there, and I think what we're talking about is some sort of experience on this level that can't be articulated because it's pre-verbal and the autobiographical memory doesn't have access to it. But it motivates us so hugely, and I think that's a real focus of where we need to get to and understand.
Yes.
And that needs to be part of the framework of understanding process of change, I would say.
Yeah, that's really clear that that all these things need to be operant.
Yeah, so it's not a matter of replacing something, it's adding to.
Yes.
So I wouldn't set myself up as a non-Freudian replacing, interpretation and what goes on in the dynamic unconscious and the return of the breath. I can flow with that. I don't go with the Oedipus complex and I don't go with the death instinct, but there are things that I think are really useful.
Yes. But what you've said earlier is you don't go with the Oedipus complex or the death instinct because they're, to your mind, rather universal. Universal and one explanation of something. Yeah. And then I think everything you've said is about something dynamic and mobile, about looking at all these different aspects and holding them in mind at once. Yeah. So I suppose the answer to how change takes place is that it's in the mind of the therapist, and all these different aspects of the patient need to be attended to perhaps in different ways, but in all ways that you approach the treatment situation, and it's a process. Yes. So the idea that the Beezer interpretation will rearrange the internal world is as limited as the idea that if somebody tells you how to behave differently, you
ain't going to work. You can't just bolt it on.
You can't just bolt it on.
If therapy was that easy, we'd be out of a job.
Well, yes, that's true. That is absolutely.
I just tell you what you need to do and go away and do it.
Yes, if only, yes.
So change is a difficult process.
Change is a difficult process. Yes, there's no shortage in the world of good advice, is there? The problem is taking it.
Yes. Linked to this is how some people are maybe easier to work with and bring about change.
Yes, and I would be interested to go on to that. The people that are easy to work with bring about change, and the most difficult people. Yeah.
And if you're looking at attachment, secure attachment obviously is the optimal. Avoidant dismissing attachment is some way down to being more disturbed. Ambivalent resistant preoccupied enmeshed attachment is even, and then unresolved or disorganized, is going off the scale. So when you're working with someone, say, who is predominantly preoccupied, and normally it's a angry preoccupation with past hurts and attachment feelings. Grievances, yes. So mourning a loss or letting go of something can be very difficult. And also down-regulating. Their emotions are under-regulated. So, they're like a little boat on a stormy emotional sea all the time.
Tossed about.
Yeah. Whereas it's the opposite, and that's interesting with these combinations in romantic relations. With the avoidant man, it's too emotionally detached and cut off. So I often say to a couple I'm working with, you need to be a little bit more like each other. You need to be a little more emotionally regulated like your husband or partner. And you need to be more aware of your emotions like your wife or female partner. And you see the same combinations in same-sex relationships too.
Of course. So
with a more preoccupied person, your work's a bit more cut out in bringing about change. It's possible, but again, the one thing I should stress too, although we talk about these things as classifications, because that's the way the research talks, what we're really talking about, and Arietta Slade makes this point, is attachment phenomena.
Yeah, nicely put there.
And then also thinking about someone, not everyone's avoidant in the same way, it's on a dimensional. Someone can be really avoidant off the Geiger counter almost, and someone can be far less avoidant, and the same with the preoccupied. So, I'm working with a lot of preoccupied patients at the moment, mainly female. And some are really, the person I saw this morning is off the scale, and others far So change with someone who isn't so disturbed is going to be easier and can be facilitated more readily than someone who's really off the Geiger counter, as it were.
Well, sure, yes. Going back then to change, that reminded me of something you said about, I wondered if the language maybe is more helpful to change. If people understand, if people have some language with which to understand why they behave in the way they do, it produces less defensiveness, less and less guilt.
Yes, and this is what I meant when I said earlier about attachment theory being an accessible theory for people.
Yes.
We all have attachment experiences. And Bowlby was, this is one reason that Bowlby got into trouble in psychoanalysis. He was very clear about a different use of language. Okay, he would say attachment theory is a form of object relations, but his language was very different and got him into trouble in a way that Winnicott and Fairbairn didn't quite get into trouble, even though they were challenging Freud and Klein in different ways.
Yes.
So yes, the language used can be used by the person and can be used to explain to the client what's going on, so that again they have meaning. We're meaning-making people,
Just so,
and if we haven't got meaning for our experience, it's frightening. If we've got some meaning for what's going on, it's containing. And I think attachment theory in particular can help people have meaning for what they've experienced in the past and what they're going through now.
So in people's preoccupations that are watching this video, that dates me DVD, about how to really, what are the most difficult parts of the work and how to manage that. I wonder if you could say some more about your own experiences about the most difficult parts of the work. You've obviously said, people further down the line are obviously going to be more challenging.
Well, what's most difficult, of course, is if someone really isn't fitted to a psychoanalytic way of working. And then I think you can give it a go, but you might have to refer on.
And what sort of person would that be then? What sort of thing do you have in mind?
It can be someone who maybe isn't quite psychologically minded enough to use it, thinks in a very concrete sort of way and can't be helped to get out of that mindset.
And when you make a transference interpretation, thinks you're obsessed with yourself.
Well, it could be. But I tend not to, especially in the early stages, make transference interpretation. I tend to work much more with what's going on in their everyday relationships to start with.
Yes.
And later bring in when there's more of a good working alliance. That's the time to start conscience.
That's really important point to make, isn't it, for people starting out and for people thinking about how best to help the person that's with their client or patient that they're with.
And this is what
there can be a tyranny of the transference interpretation, can't there?
And this is something Paul Renn, an American integrationist and relational psychologist, who's on the postdoc New York training, stresses that there's too much of an emphasis on what goes on, he would use the term the office, with the analyst and the patient, and not enough what is going on in their everyday lives. That's what people, that's what we need to key into.
Yeah, and that's what people bring that is troubling them. Yes.
But it can be seen as a form of narcissism on the part of therapists and analysts. It could be all about the boy or the girl.
Well, yes, indeed. But I suppose the argument against that is that the laboratory you've got is in the room in the relationship between you, and that everything will be repeated there where you can at least look at it.
Well, not necessarily. I think where it gets repeated most intensely is in their intimate relationships outside of that.
Well, that fits again with with your attachment theory base, doesn't it? That there are other intimate relationships in which this gets repeated and where it needs attention.
And more intensely.
And more intensely.
Yeah. And I think that's where the work needs to be focused. Of course, there will be stuff going on too that at times will need understanding and ruptures repaired and transferences discussed. Yes. But I think it's a mistake to start there and ignore what's going on in their everyday life. And of course, Freud talked about the transferences of everyday life. And we need to work with those, I would say.
That's really interesting, yes. Yeah, and can we go on a bit to talk about the more difficult patients? You said clients. One of the difficulties is some people you might as well be speaking in Swahili. It's not a language they understand, and it can be unhelpful to keep pushing.
One of the things that I find particularly difficult, and again it's linked to the AAI research, is the discourse style of someone, particularly if they're preoccupied. I've been aware in the early stages of our conversation that in my eagerness to jump in, I might talk over you a little bit and not turn take in a good enough way.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, in a way, that's not what's supposed to happen. All is meant to happen is I'm meant to elicit as best we can, all the things that you know and can tell the people who are watching this. And
you're doing that very well, but I'm aware that I'm jumping in when it's not quite my turn.
It's not quite your turn, and that's anxiety.
I don't think it's anxiety. It can be for some people. It may be anxiety. It's my enthusiasm to say what's in my mind and maybe not lose it.
Maybe not lose it. That's really important. But that is really important, isn't it? Because my immediate thought was it must be anxiety because obviously I'm anxious.
Right.
But of course, what you're saying is, well, no, actually, it may be much more to do with your your eagerness and the fear that you've got something to say, and people looking at this need to hear it.
Yeah.
That you might lose, and we might go off track. Yes.
So going back to a difficult client, also the helpful use of AAI research. In the initial interview, a person will come with a specific discourse style, which will be a key indicator of their main attachment state of mind.
Right.
So with an avoidant man, there can be a paucity of memories and like getting blood out of a stone. With a preoccupied enmeshed female, say, or man for that matter, but predominantly you can't get a word in edgeways, and they're very highly anxious and go off on tangents.
Yes.
And it can be very difficult and it has to have a firm and well-established working life before you can start feeding that.
Yes.
But it can be very, very anger-making. You're not letting me in, and you're talking. I try to make you talk over me.
Yes.
So no turn taking.
No turn taking. That's an indicator of problems in the therapeutic alliance.
And there's research with people who go on dates, and when turn taking isn't part of it, they say, "I don't want to see that person ever again."
Yes, isn't that interesting? Yes, but it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? We're relational beings in context.
And I don't know about you, but I listen to the Today programme, and when a politician is being interviewed, and Humphreys and the politician are talking over each other, I get enraged.
Yes.
For fuck's sake, listen to each other.
Yes,
turn take.
Listen to each other. Yes.
So vicariously, not quite being traumatised, but I do get irritated by it.
And that's really, and that is part of the diagnostic process in the early stages of somebody coming to see you. Can we do this together?
Well, also the creative use of attachment research. So I never apply an attachment interview, adult attachment interview with the client, but I use the findings creatively to understand where that person's come from, what sort of experience they've got, and as I say, it keys into their intersubjective and attachment, and what sort of person I might need to be, but also what it might stir in me, because as therapists, we all have our internal working models that can get activated with a particular client. So we may become avoidant or too preoccupied, and we need to be able to see that.
So, to the question, could you talk to the audience about difficult cases? What the answer is well, it is really not about the presenting problem. It is about how the person can function in a dynamic.
Yes, and that's interesting again, because the AAI, it's not looking so much at the content
but the process,
but the discourse style in which it's told.
Yes.
Which is an indication of where they're coming from in attachment terms.
Yes.
And whether someone is too unresolved and therefore has an angry preoccupation with past attachment figures, or is defensively avoidant, and therefore again the paucity of memories. And that doesn't actually, there's a contradiction with them when they give examples, say what would happen when you were ill, and then it would contradict with their idealization of the parent-child relationship.
So you're looking for discongruences in a way, yes.
In memory, yeah, but also in the actual discourse.
In memory and in discourse.
Really helpful. I would say to anyone, really acquaint yourself with attachment theory research so that you use it creatively in your clinical work. But going back to the difficult client, yes, I think one of the things is with someone who's really preoccupied on the dimension off the scale almost, how can you actually engage with them and have some sort of emotional connection? Will they let you in?
That's a very everyday, profound way of putting it, isn't it? Will they let you in? Because if they won't let you in, you can spend a lot of time having some sort of quasi-treatment, can't you, where you're not actually meeting each other.
I mean, the person I had a telephone session with in Cambridge today was very preoccupied to start with. She got into a preoccupied state talking about the situation at work. She said something that was very significant, I thought, which was about managers who aren't very good. And then she went into a long spiel about all sorts of other stuff. And I had to bring her back to that comment. And with her history, as what she tells her, relates to herself as the unpicked up child with parents who weren't good enough. And I said, I think there's a transference. This is why you're so impatient and irritated and maybe get yourself into trouble with these directors, because you see they're not very good and they're incompetent. And I think there's a transference on to you being the child who's had incompetent parent, and that can lead her to be overprotective of her own team because she's not going to be. There's a sort of compensation going. But it wasn't until I could bring her back that she could enter into a more reflective state, really use that and see it. Now before, she wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yes.
A few years back. And
perhaps before, earlier in the session as well, did you think it was necessary that she talked about some other things?
I think that
something. I'm waving my hands in the air. Something processed.
I think she wasn't processing it. She was in a non-reflective, slightly dysregulated state, and it had been like that most of the session because of anxieties about various things. Having a baby by donor insemination, having had 2 miscarriages, and will this baby be all right? Yes. As well as the work situation. So, there was a lot of anxiety which led to the old model being activated, where there was a non-reflective circle and always having a worry. Yes. I say to some clients, you're never alone if you've got a worry. And also to help someone see that they always need this worry. And there you are, you've gone again. Initially you couldn't do that, or you couldn't work. Now they can see it and start to do something about it.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about whether, if you had picked it up immediately, or whether it was actually, just because it took you a minute or two to catch it, or whether it was actually functional to let it run for a bit so that you could
The functional side was that then I could feed back to her that there was something very significant that was said that we really needed to think about and reflect on. You didn't do that. And you went off onto these tangents and into this discourse style, which is very preoccupied and helpful. So it was helpful to let it run so that she could see that.
She wouldn't have said
No.
And what about, obviously, you assume it's difficult to pick at one vignette, but the thought that came to my mind was, and of course, that somewhere there's a worry that she's not a good enough parent, isn't there, to hold on to these babies? Yes. So that again...
So this is the overcompensation.
You'd be knitting all these things in.
Absolutely.
But you're based on the understanding.
That's
the
a creative use of theory and our work. It's not just one thing. It is being very creative and bringing all of these things into it in a very creative way that's meaningful for the client. And it is a specific skill.
Oh, it is, yes.
And also seamlessly, I think, linking theory to practice. What so many social workers, probation officers, and I think therapists don't have that capacity to seamlessly link theory and practice.
And do you think it can be taught, or do you think it's also something related to this state of mind or this internal position? That
it's tricky. I think hopefully some of it can be taught, and I used to teach psychotherapists and try to bring this about, and also in supervision, of course. It's difficult to know whether someone's got it or they haven't. Some people, I think, just aren't good practitioners and good clinicians, and some people less so.
Yes, and some people can really write about the theory very well, but they can't apply it. And some people are very good practitioners, and their writing is...
Or they have this view that it's all touchy-feely, all the emotions, and the theory doesn't matter. That could be defensive too.
Which is equally defensive.
So splitting off either way, or either too theoretical or too sort of emotional.
Yes. So thinking about
the balance between
the balance, yes, that's the word we're talking about, balance, aren't we? Because in thinking about and asking you about difficult clients or patients, what you've talked about, you haven't talked about again. These really, horrendous cases, some of which you've evidently dealt with, but about, the way in which the person is able to approach themselves and you, as to really being much more decisive than
It also raises the issue of what is horrendous. What I see mainly, what I saw in forensics was that the person had a double whammy. They had the big traumas, sexual abuse or violence, physical abuse, losses, abandonment, as well as cumulative developmental trauma, was seriously misattuned. So they had both of those. What I see mainly in private practice is that the big traumas aren't there so much, but the horrendous side is the cumulative developmental trauma that gets in the way hugely.
Yes.
And again on a continuum for some people. So it's trauma. Some people call it trauma with a small t and trauma with a big T. It's trauma.
Yes, well, that's Masood Khan's position, isn't it? Absolutely. Cumulative trauma.
No, absolutely.
That it builds up.
And he cited Anna Freud and Bowlby in developing this concept of cumulative trauma.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether he quite keyed into it being the mismatch. Maybe he did because of his own experience with his own brother.
That I don't know.
But no, I mean, he was on to something.
He was certainly on.
And I think Winnicott was too, of course, his therapist.
Yes, of course, that's right. So, because one of the things I wanted to ask about was working with couples where there's violence in the relationship.
Right.
Because I think that's something that people, ordinary practitioners can be very worried about. So I thought perhaps you could talk something about, some more about that, but also it links in, doesn't it, with how you understand it and the position you're able to take.
Well, it's a very complex topic, and obviously it's why I do a workshop on it. It's very difficult to sum it up.
Indeed.
But I would say, in broad terms, when there's a low level of violence, and it might be mutual with both parties involved in violence, and there is a need to understand, a wish to understand that and work on it, working conjointly with the couple can be indicated and can be a good thing to do in terms of therapeutic action, bring about change. If it's a battering relationship, I wouldn't go near couple therapy. In that case, very often the woman might need help to separate from the battering relationship, the man, and the man would need to be worked with separately to work on the trauma that's leading him to be a batterer. So you've got to have a very careful risk assessment. And some people, just say if there's violence in a couple, you don't go near it. I don't run with that. I think it can be productive, but you've got to be very careful about how you assess the risk. The other thing about violence in the home is that research shows that when children are witnessing violence between their parents, it's a real risk factor for developing disorganized, disoriented attachment. and also in adulthood of becoming a victim of violence, whether it's a man or a woman.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So it doesn't split 50-50. Yeah, that people are more likely to become victims than perpetrators if they've witnessed violence at home.
And what the NSPCC research and Home Office research shows is that in terms of male violence and female violence in relation to children, it's pretty 50-50.
Yeah.
Domestic abuse, it's mainly the woman that's at risk and is the victim. Stranger violence outside the home, predominantly perpetrated by young males, and young males are predominantly the victims of that. So there are different scenarios and different vulnerabilities to violence. One of the risk factors in a relationship is a woman being pregnant.
Well, yes. Do you want to say something about that? About
Just
the
that
dynamic?
The research shows
yeah, but why
what
you
the
think that
dynamic is.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
That the research shows that women, a third of women are battered or beaten when they're pregnant. Now, psychodynamically, there may be an understanding of that. Does a man fear being usurped? You know, does he want this child? Is it going to be a competitor? There can be various reasons why, or it can be part of something that was characteristic of the relationship anyway, and whether you're pregnant or not, I beat you. But it is a risk factor, and it might be to do with there's a competitor on the way.
Yes.
What the research shows too is that the younger the child, the more at risk they are of infanticide. So children under 1 are more at risk, and also that boy babies are more at risk than girl babies of violence. The other thing about abuse that's maybe not widely known but comes out of the research that the NSPCC and Home Office done is that in terms of sexual abuse, the main abuser in the home is a brother.
Yes, I think that isn't widely known, isn't it? It's normally
followed by other male relatives.
Yes, it's normally
but
thought
the brother
to be
is the main.
The brother is the main perpetrator. Yes.
Yeah. So, getting back to working or not working with a violent couple, what I do when I first see a couple, anyway, is I see them together and hear each of their stories of what's brought them to couple therapy, why they think they need it, what is going on, what are their goals. Then I tend to see each partner separately and take a history. And then something that might be difficult to have said when they were together might emerge like an affair or violence. Does raise the question, which is a very thorny question, if one partner's having an affair and it's not known, what do you do with that information?
Yes, it puts you, it puts the therapist in a very difficult position, doesn't it? But the other side of it is that if you don't do that, presumably it's possible there's a whole lot of information that you will never get.
Yes, no, absolutely.
And to offer them the best chance of help. Yes, there's arguments.
So again, as I would with an individual client, I would take a trauma history. I would hear what their problem is first and what their goals are, but then take a relationship history, a trauma history, and an attachment history. And whilst monitoring their discourse style, of course, and what's going on between them. And having then some loose sort of feel of where they're coming from in trauma and attachment terms.
And this is, and that then shapes how you might think about the future work.
Yeah, it will inform the work. But as I say, I don't favour a one issue. So if someone comes with just violence, I wouldn't just work with the violence. One issue therapies, I don't think work.
Well, it doesn't make sense to after anything you've said, does it? That because the whole of your discourse has been about how things are interrelated, and you cannot
split
them up.
I don't think it's helpful.
And it's not helping. It's not
whether
helpful.
It's a drink problem or smoking or drug misuse. You need to work with the whole person.
Well, that's probably very helpful for lots of people, because we tend, I don't know, for society, we're more like to split things up, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, some approaches might be helpful. For example, the woman I was talking about earlier, who was in a lesbian relationship, her partner's a heavy smoker, and she said, you know, can you work with this person or recommend someone to work with a smoking issue? And I said, you know, that I would think that was an expression of something that's gone wrong for her. That since 14, she's now nearly 40. She smoked, you know, 50 a day. There's something going on there.
To this thing that's poisoning her. Yes.
But having said, some people find hypnotherapy might be helpful, but my experience with people who've had it, a bit like CBT, it can work for a little while,
yes, but it doesn't.
It falls into the wayside.
Last. Yes. Yeah. So, I can't quite know how to frame this question. So again, thinking about the couple that have violence between them, you said there's a difference between a couple where there's mild to moderate violence and a batterer.
Low level of violence.
Low level, that's the word phrase used. And a batterer. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, because of course somebody, you know, you've had a lot of experience of these things.
It reflects a level of disturbance in the people involved. Again, what the research shows is that young relationships, people who are young in a relationship, tend to be more violent, mutually so, and grow out of it. It's almost like a part of growing up and maturing emotionally and psychologically. But they might need help, nonetheless, to start with.
Yes.
With the battering relationship, I think it's very complex. What the research shows is very often the woman has been a victim of violence in her childhood, from a father, say, or a mother. And then you've got what Lyons Roof calls a sort of dynamic where it's hostile and helpless combination. So you've got the hostile man with disorganized attachment, and you've got the helpless woman with disorganized attachment. So there's that fit, and they play out that side of it. I also think there's something going on for the woman with fear without resolution that characterises the disorganised child. That's what Mary Main sees. This is why the child in the strange situation can't go to the parent. I'm frightened, and there's no resolution of it because I'm frightened of you, but you're my attachment figure.
Yes.
And I think that dynamic can get replayed in adulthood with a battery.
Yes.
I'm attached to you, but I'm frightened of you. Beat me up.
Yes.
But I keep coming back to you. All these people put all sorts of things in place, refugees and all, and I come back to you.
Keep coming back, yes.
And that's the power of what's often called a traumatic attachment. Not a secure attachment, not one of the organised insecure, but a traumatic attachment.
Yes.
It very often goes by the name of Stockholm Syndrome.
Oh, yes.
I think what they're really talking about is a traumatic attachment.
Yes, yes. The Stockholm Syndrome was about being taken
Patty
hostage,
Hearst,
wasn't it? So one of those, yes.
That's right.
It was her, yes. Yeah, but actually what you're saying is you say that, so somebody, obviously we don't know Patty Hearst, but somebody else in that situation would not have, if she'd had a secure attachment, once after being kidnapped, before she was kidnapped, she may not have developed Stockholm Syndrome.
That's right. And wouldn't be attracted to a batterer or stay in a battering relationship.
Yes.
Would see the warning signs and have enough internal resilience and robustness to get out of it.
Yes.
But someone with a particular history, a traumatic history, can't do that and are playing something out.
And what's the prognosis then, would you say?
Not good.
Because
Not
you
good.
said you would have to separate them and perhaps help her to leave.
And when people are so disturbed, they may not be able to use the sort of therapeutic help that they need. That's part of the problem too.
Well, ain't that the truth? Yes. Yeah.
So I saw that in probation with some of my offenders. They were psychologically minded and up for it and could use it, and made good progress. Others they couldn't. Too damaged maybe, or weren't psychologically minded enough.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course we have to make those choices and put things in place that might work for them, but not my sort of more psychodynamic way of working.
But I suppose that's what you're saying generally, isn't it? That you have to try. You have to offer whatever you can offer, as you never know who fully who can take it up. For instance, the patient, your client that you were talking about, you said a few years ago she wouldn't have been able to do that. She wasn't an obvious prospect. But
well, I think she was. I could see
something.
the potential, but I knew it would be quite a difficult process. With someone else, it may be they become a heart sync client. It's her again or him again, and I'm not going to get far. And sometimes I might encourage them to move on. Or
yes, well, that would be. I'd like to talk about ending therapy generally, but that might be a good link with the heart sync kind of client, and because I imagine people looking at this know that one. And you know what you do and how you might manage that.
Well, sometimes I think because of their own limitations, they may be ready to leave without an awful lot of progress being made, or it could be a Freudian flight into health, or the secondary gains from illness. I think these are very helpful concepts from Freud. So yes, I mean, particularly with avoidant men, there can be a flight into hell. Thank you very much, Doctor.
I feel much better now.
I'm okay now.
Yes.
You've done a wonderful job on me.
Yes.
Bye.
Yes.
So that could be a flight into hell.
Yeah, indeed, yes. But I suppose they're easier to deal with as a practitioner than the one who doesn't want to go.
Yeah.
Who's hanging on and every time they come you think, oh, you know, I'm not really looking forward to this. But that, you know, seem to, you know, want to go on forever.
Yeah.
So I wondered.
And that can be the more preoccupied person.
So that would be the attachment style that
yes,
you would.
I can't deal with the loss. You have become a significant attachment figure. I'm not resolving anything really with you, but I've now become so attached to you I can't leave you. The other thing about long-term work that I've found is that whereas we try to imbue someone with an internalised sense of us as a helpful person in a Winnicottian way, you've introjected or internalised my helping, self-soothing, comforting and mentalising presence, so now you're ready to leave. With some people I find that although they make progress, they can't quite do that for themselves, and that people who stay in therapy for years, who I enjoy working with, and wouldn't necessarily want to leave, but say to them quite explicitly, I think the only reason you're staying is that on your own, or with a partner who hasn't quite got the mind to do this, you can't quite process what's going on, and cumulatively the stresses build up, and then you have a breakdown.
Yeah.
So the only reason for staying is that you come here, have a session once a week with my mind, and we process what's going on, and that keeps you on an even keel. And I have several clients who explicitly are there for that reason. So that it doesn't end, but there's a rationale for it continuing.
Yes. So that's not the patient who can't, or the client who can't change, but can't let go. That's
no, that's someone who just needs another mind to process things. And I think, again, that needs to be thought about.
Yes, and that needs to be
acknowledged.
That needs to be acknowledged and accepted, isn't it? That,
and I'm quite upfront with those people that, you know, we've really resolved some of the main reasons that brought you to therapy. Say, you're having a breakdown because you're trying to be the star at work, in, say, a TV company, and it's just putting you under too much stress and you have breakdowns continually. So part of our solution to that was to co-work, because the core trauma for her was of being too alone. So she wanted to be the star in a narcissistic way, but couldn't manage it. So co-working, be fine. And it's similar in a way. Well, we'd resolved that problem in a way over a period of years. But then she can't quite process things on her own, and did have a break, and then things built up and had another breakdown. So came back, and this is why we're doing it this way.
A sort of maintenance. It's a sort of maintenance, isn't it,
yes,
in a good way?
In a way.
Yes.
But it is processing something she can't quite do on her own.
Can't quite process it.
And quite can't do with her avoidant aspect.
Yeah. And do you think she will eventually acquire that ability?
She's got it up to a point, but under stress,
Under stress,
it breaks down.
It goes back, it breaks down again. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what do you think generally needs to be in place before somebody's ready to leave then?
It's very difficult to know
what the magic formula is, yes?
No. A lot of people think they're ready to leave, and then all of the old issues come up when they're faced with the break and the separation.
But I bet you know somewhere viscerally when you've turned that corner and you're heading for ending.
Yeah, and I might then float it, or indeed the client might. Then how it ends is another question. Some people want a process to end it. It might be 3 months, 6 months. Some people do it in the session.
You just say they're off.
Yes, I'm ready to go. So I say, do you want to make this the last session? No. Yes, that's fine. So people are different. And I don't think it's necessarily defensive. It's just that probably they've been working towards that anyway. So it may, on the face of it, seem sudden, but in another way it's not.
And do you think people leave according to their attachment style?
Yes, and whether they come back would be according to their attachment styles too. But hopefully some form of earned security has been put into place, so that the old attachment style would only come up when they're highly stressed. But if something's been put in place, also I think an important aspect that I put in place and make explicit, the door's not closed. If you hit a crisis, you can always come back. And I did that with offenders too. Most of them didn't need to, but just having that sense, there's a safe haven to go to if I need it. Help them leave without necessarily sometimes acting out and re-offending in terms to keep the relationship.
Yes, well, it's the same with, there is, that's thought about people who find a secure base in a prison, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. They become institutional.
They become institutional.
So I'll re-offend to get back into what I'm used to and familiar with.
Yes.
I feel safe then. On the outside, I don't.
I mean, that's been larded through everything you've said, the provision of a safe space where these things can be thought about in your head and then in the actual environment is obviously the prerequisite for anything therapeutic to be able to take place.
Yeah, and I think it's there in all sorts of ways. Very explicitly, I think, in attachment theory, there's got to be a safe haven and a secure enough base to explore. And in that way talk about and elaborate what is going on for you. Can you explore your inner world? Can you bring dreams? I encourage people to keep a snag book so that...
Yes, you've used that word before, snag book.
Yeah, that's something going on in their everyday life. No need to write a big screed. But someone said something that you didn't quite understand, or you had a mood state, maybe watching a play on or a film or whatever it may be, a piece of music. Can you just jot it down, bring it, and then we can explore it.
So that's a snag book.
Yeah.
Yes.
And really, I need the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
So often people come with what I call a broad reportage of what's going on, which isn't really what they need. And I try to encourage them to bring something that's more almost verbatim and, what was going on interactionally between you and your child or you and your partner.
But that's also, I suppose, the modelling for life, isn't it? If we can learn what snagged us and pay attention to it.
And of course it's a way of uncovering what is happening procedurally.
Yeah.
Without that you're not getting to it. So you need that material to have some sense of what is happening automatically or implicitly and procedurally that you're not saying but keep repeating. So you're reinforcing this old model unhelpfully. We need to see that and work on it.
Yes.
So I always say, I'm dependent on you for the material. You've got to bring it.
Yes, you've got to. The client has the material, yes.
Work with dreams, and I encourage people to keep a dream book beside their bed. As we know, they lurid 1 minute and fly from the mind the next. They're working on all sorts of different levels.
Yes. Because there was something else you said that I wanted to come just ask you a bit more. You talked about the core trauma.
Yeah.
And I thought that might be quite interesting to say some more about.
What I do find with a lot of people is that you can get some understanding of what it is that they are most fearful of. And so often it is about being alone and not having a good connection with another person. And the person I was describing earlier, wanting to work alone and have all the plaudits for doing a wonderful job as a TV producer, executive producer, it was just creating stress because she was too alone with it. And that was triggering off what was really going on in terms of a core trauma. I'm too alone. What I need to keep stable is an intersubjective connection, intersubjective relatedness or emotional connectedness. Without that, I'm frightened.
And would you say that's a core trauma for a large number of, or a large majority of people?
I think so. This is why breakups are so difficult for people. I'm losing you. You know, part of what I experienced in childhood was of losing someone, not having that wonderful connection, even if it was proximal separation. My parents there, but I'm not connected to him or her. She's dissociating, or he's dissociating. You know, I have a connection. This is what generates ambivalent resistance pattern in a child, inconsistency parenting. I'm sometimes there, I'm sometimes not. So the child becomes hyper-vigilant and ever watchful. And part of the trauma is, I'm too alone and I keep losing you. So at a breakup, you know, or I fear I'm losing you, even though you may not, you're just looking at someone else, like this woman I talked about earlier. I have a panic about that because I think then you're going to leave me and I'm going to be all alone again. So I think it is, and this is why I say attachment theory is a theory of trauma. The trauma of a separation, loss and abandonment.
Broken attachment.
Yeah. And of course that can get played out with holiday breaks in a more stereotypical way in therapy. How do people cope with breaks? But also endings.
Which is kind of where we came into this, yes. And you said sometimes when people think about ending everything, all the problems come back.
Sometimes it can. I think in the literature that I've read, the therapist may think they've worked on all the problems, but I don't think the approach has been informed enough by a trauma and attachment perspective. And then when it comes to the actual ending, it all resurfaces. It's less likely to happen if you're more au fait with these dynamics and you're working on them. Then I think you've built in some sort of resilience into the person.
Yes.
They're more earned secure, they're aware of the tendency to feel frightened at a loss or separateness. And the affect regulation has been enhanced to the degree that they can, a term I often use is a more competent self.
Yes, because when you first started talking about it, what it made me think of was, you know, the thing all clinicians know that, a bit like adolescence, you know, when the ending is spoken and set, then, as it were, all the previous stuff comes back in a small way, in a way like adolescence is revisits.
Well, it always depends on what's gone on before.
I think you're talking about something rather different. Something about that maybe something has got missed about the trauma, so that the actual ending is much more traumatic.
Yes, that hasn't really been worked on or resolved enough to the extent that these things can be resolved. With difficulties in adolescence, I think it very much depends on what's gone before. It's the same with people who may be vulnerable to PTSD. The more securely attached person who can process something, ask for help, use that help, even though they've experienced something similar to someone who goes on to develop full-blown PTSD symptoms. It depends on, you know, how resilient they are because of what's gone. Whereas someone who has a lot of trauma, is probably unresolved, disorganized, they experience trauma, they're going to get full-blown PTSD.
And presumably you had the experience of that when you were time in the army.
I did, but I saw it written more largely because I was in a different sort of role in probation. But as a bandmaster, I was a bandmaster, and in that sense, I was the first port of call when we were in Northern Ireland or Germany if something went wrong about room theft or marital problems or bereavement, drink problem. So I was in a pastoral role, and this was what actually led me to train as a social worker with the probation when I left the army. What can I do? This is what I'm good at. I kept my band together, it grew and grew, and I said, you can't have a band that size, why aren't people leaving you? Keep sending you people thinking you're going to have this wastage, and they weren't leaving. Because I had the skill of keeping them happy and together and working.
Well, and that, I mean, that's a transferable skill, isn't it, into the work that you do now, but also, I suppose you're describing you want to be able to facilitate that skill in the client, who then, hopefully, it has enough of an earned secure attachment to take it with them.
Yes, and absolutely. And one of the things that I think brings people into therapy is when they become parents. And they start to see on some level, I'm doing to my child what was done to me, but I can't stop it. And they're playing something out again implicitly, procedurally with their child. And maybe frightening their child, being too harsh and hostile with their child, and damaging the relationship.
And do you find that they're more available at that point then to really look at what has happened to them?
I think so. Also, what I find with men who may be emotionally detached because of the avoidant, having a child, especially sometimes a female child, can really help wake them up emotionally. And it gives you the opportunity to work on the emotions with them.
Yes, because that's quite a hopeful picture, isn't it? Of somebody, a clinician, being asked to see somebody who's just become a parent, not to miss that this can lead them into reflecting on their own early experiences.
Absolutely.
In a way that they probably couldn't have done before.
Yeah, both the acting out of those in an unhelpful way with the child, but also something that could be positive in that, yes, I'm feeling something, I'm becoming bonded and attached to this child too, and I'm feeling more emotionally alive. And that gives you an opening to work on. And it can be a particular age of the child where they become aware that they may have had a loss or abusive relationships at age 3 or 5 or something. When the child reaches that age, they become aware, I'm now playing something out with my child that really belongs to the past a bit. So they have that sort of insight, and that can motivate them to come into therapy.
It takes me back in my mind to what you were saying about what happens before this kind of memory is possible, and then is, as it were, lost. Is it evoked in parenting a child under 2?
Well, I think it's another form of emotional memory. An implicit procedural memory is an action form of memory, something we do. We remember by doing.
By doing, yes.
Whether it's driving a car or having a relationship.
Yes,
so you could argue.
Or dealing with an infant reflects how you were dealt with yourself as an
Exactly
infancy.
The point I was going to make, that my interaction with my infant or my young child is a way of me remembering what happened to me. I may not have it in quite that clear cognitive way, but some inkling of that.
Yes, a body
so I need
memory.
help with this.
Yes, a body.
So they can know it cognitively, but can't change it emotionally. The emotional memory of it is too powerful. I keep doing it. It's what couples do with each other as well, but we're talking about parent-child relationships too now.
But I think that's important for the work generally, isn't it? The emotional memory is so powerful that it overrides
what you know cognitive.
Something cognitive, yes. And then talking to people about their attachment experiences and styles, so they have some handle on.
Yeah, so that's where it becomes a sort of co-construction or co-creation. So we can't know, we can't put our finger on it and say this happened, but the way you are now, and the way you're relating to your child, or the way you relate to your intimate partner would indicate that something's gone wrong on this sort of level.
Yes.
And with my clinical experience and theoretical knowledge, we can put our heads together and co-create what might have happened and give it some meaning, but also have some sort of understanding of what now we need to do to try and change.
Yes. So it gives some handle, but also at least gives some purchase on the guilt and avoidance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we probably will be very helpful for clinicians listening into this, because what people want to know more than anything, isn't it, is how to do it. What do you say?
Yes.
So that they can, so people can use it for themselves. And I think that you've modelled that.
Yes, and hopefully that can influence how someone does it. Obviously, we use ourselves in idiomatic ways, again thinking of Bonus, as a therapeutic tool. And we express our own personality in forging a relationship with our client. So it has a healthy form, say, of humour, flirtatiousness, camaraderie, warmth, even maybe attachment, love. But care and understanding. I care for you and I want to understand what's going on for you. And that's very powerful.
Absolutely, yes. And what would happen if it was somebody, I found you in the consulting room, there's somebody you didn't care about?
Yeah, it can happen on the rare occasion.
I'd imagine it is, well, of course it's rare, but I thought that might be helpful for people to think about.
No, exactly. Then I think you've got to... Can you actually be a false self, or will it actually become apparent?
Yes. Or is it a part of their defence structure which eventually you'll be able to get underneath?
Well, obviously, as I said earlier, every relationship is unique with the emergent property of a relational third. And sometimes it will work, and other times we'll bang your head against a brick wall and maybe we should end this.
Yes.
But you may unconsciously, or implicitly, or sometimes consciously be giving out the message, I really like working with you. Shouldn't do it ethically, but we're all human beings.
Yes. Well, I was thinking about, all defences are offensive to somebody. And, whether you think, certainly with the attachment lens, that if you find somebody's defences offensive, whether that's a point at which you've got a point of understanding, or it's a point at which you have to man up or woman up to the fact that this isn't this is not
whether
something
it's
you can
defences or whether it's personality traits.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it? Which is it? Yeah.
For me, it's probably more, I don't quite like you as a personality.
Yeah, but and do you think personality traits are different then from
they are, of course, but they are again influenced by, Fonagy would see these attachment states of mind as sort of defences that have had to grow up because of the idiosyncrasies of the parenting the child's experienced. So there is that side, but can someone hear what you're saying, or are they always arguing with you? Will they let you in? Are they know-alls? How unpleasant is it working with certain personalities? And I work from my own home, and that might influence who I want to let in.
Yes, well, sure. But thinking about people listening to this, it's got to be all right to say, no, I can't do this. In fact, what you're saying is it's unethical if you really don't.
I think it's more unethical not to say it and
not to say it than go on with something you don't want to be doing. Yeah, it's more unethical. Be a bit more upfront. Well, everything you've said is about some sort of level of emotional honesty in the clinician.
Yeah.
That is the prerequisite to being able to offer the safe space that's necessary for to work on attachment problems.
And that again is a main precept of relational psychoanalysis, being emotionally honest. And that's why it feeds into being more ready to self-disclose, for instance. But also to repair ruptures. Put your hand up if you've got it wrong.
To repair ruptures, you talked about that earlier, and that also seems a very central tool, doesn't it, for this kind of work?
Absolutely.
Is that, you know, it isn't the rupture, it's how it's put right that gives people both confidence in the clinician, but the chance to, you know how to repair things themselves.
So in comparison to probably a stereotypical classical approach, you're not the expert who's anonymous and sitting back and saying it's all in you.
Yes.
These innate drives, it's all in you.
Yes.
It's what is going on between us. We haven't talked about transience, and that was one of the general things you might have wanted to talk about. From a relational point of view, transience is often seen as not intermittent. I have a counter-transience to your transience. It's more that there's an ongoing process, might see it in Beyond's terms of projective and introjective identification, in a more relational way of continuing process of reciprocal mutual influence. So all the time, this is why I'm reading your face, what I'm seeing is influencing on some level, however subtle, my reaction. And that is going on all the time. In terms of more explicit form of transience, it could be what we've already talked about. The internal working models come with sets of predictions and expectations which can get projected or transferred onto the person, and that needs to be seen. Who do I represent to you from your inner world of past experiences that you're now playing?
But one of the things I thought you said was particularly interesting and maybe helpful for people is that it isn't just in the transference that these motifs are, also in people's intimate relationships, and if you don't pay attention to the intimate relationships and you focus too much on the transference, thought you were saying, you'll miss what it is that.
Absolutely, and this is where I think Fairbairn started the move, and he influenced Bowlby, that we are talking about real experiences as well, not just fantasies. I mean, this is Bowlby's main, argument with Klein. Real relationship 0, unconscious fantasies, off the scale. So you've got to deal with the real experiences that someone's had in the past, but also is having now. Not everything's a transference.
Not everything's a transference.
But a lot is.
But I think that. Yeah.
But to make those distinctions.
But again, you're talking about being alive every moment to what this might be, listening to what this might be, rather than imposing your theoretical framework, whatever it is, onto what you think it should be.
Absolutely. And having your clinical ear out, as I described earlier with this client, when she was talking about being impatient with bad managers, having that ear out, knowing her history, there's a transference going on there.
But maybe a transference to you too?
It could be, but then that can be stereotypical, that it's got to be about me. And whereas I know she values me highly, and found today's session helpful. So I don't think that would be there. And if you brought it in, it would go nowhere, and she just wouldn't understand.
So you've got to think about it, but you have to have a realistic appraisal of the situation and the here and now,
and what's likely to be going on.
I think that. I think that is helpful.
But of course sometimes there will be an enactment, and we haven't touched on enactments very much, which I think is a really important topic in terms of relational approach, that all the time some sort of enactment is going on, and there's more of a pressure towards enactment when there's some sort of unresolved trauma or the return of the oppressed.
And what do you mean by enactment then?
That something that can't be thought about, of a traumatic nature, instead of being talked about and thought about, is enacted, whether it's violence or some sort of, I see you in a certain way. So it can be in the transference, I don't trust you. That's an enactment of something that they may have had in their past life. So it gets enacted, and we need to look at that. And of course, there can often be mutual enactment. And we can go into different roles. Yes,
and finish up being somebody that you're behaving in a way that you would never expect yourself to behave in.
And part of the enactment can obviously be you're the seducer and I'm seducing you. Seduced and seduced. But also, the drama triangle. Who's the perpetrator? Who's the victim? Who's the rescuer?
Yeah.
We're in and out of these roles, and it can get enacted in the blink of an eye.
Yes. But you need your snag book, don't you? The therapist needs one too.
Well, yes.
Something catches and you
But this is
realise
what I mean by having that clinical ear out,
yes.
and not letting it pass, to actually go back to something.
it.
And so often I do see that something has been said, alluded to, gone on, something been very, I've got to get all this out. They miss what's really important. Another phenomenon you might have been aware of, phenomenon, is that something really significant and important comes up in the last minute of the session. As they're going out the door, they say something that's most significant in the session.
I'm hoping that's not happening to us, because we're running out of time now.
Yes, we are.
So I'm hoping that's not happened to us. Have we covered all the things that we needed to cover? Yes. Oh, well, it's not going to happen to us then. Is there anything else you wanted to be sure that you'd said?
No, I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been really stimulating.
Well, it has
really enjoyable.
Yes.
I'm glad we've got the good mix and match going on that we could have this dialogue.
Yes, because we didn't know each other whatsoever. And you had looked me up and I had looked you up. That was the closest it had got.
That's as far as we got. Snooped.
Yes.
We stalked each other online.
We had a little look.
In science matchmaking service.
To see how, but yes, when we come from different theoretical backgrounds to pretty much, to something that we might see things from a different lens of the prism, but to the same points, isn't it? Yes.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
But I think you've said that all the way through what you've described is your constant endeavour to keep the baby in mind when you're trying to bail out.
I like the term, it's not either or, it's both and. Both
and, yes. And I mean, we aim in all our work to avoid binary solutions, don't we? That we're meant to be able to open something out.
I think binary is a real trap.
Yes, yes. But of course, if you're feeling anxious, you might cling to some bit of something or the other.
It then can be an enactment that leads to a rupture that needs to be repaired.
Yes, I think
none of us are superhuman.
I think that's a lovely thing to sort of finish up with, is that we don't have to be superhuman. We just have to be, when it comes to words, good enough.
But robust enough to revisit things.
Able to revisit and put up our hand, and you said that's very therapeutically helpful, both in holding the frame, but actually showing people this is this is okay. You can repair things.
That does then generate a sense of security.
I think that's
more secure attachment.
Yes. I think you've really made that point. I mean, I agree with you, but even if I didn't, you've made that point very clearly. I think, and coherently, along with the other ones. Okay, then. Well,
thank you very much.